In this lesson, we're going to talk about the writing sample, which is the very last part of the LSAT. And we're going to take a look at one. I'm going to give you some specific strategies about how to approach it. But first, I want to talk about the big picture stuff. Why is the writing sample even there? What purpose does it serve? How does it work? And so we'll start with how it works. It's at the very end of the LSAT. It's after the 5 multiple choice sections. Your proctors are going to collect your multiple choice sections. They're going to collect your multiple choice answer sheet. And they'll either distribute the writing sample, which is in a separate packet. They'll either distribute it after the 5 multiple choice sections, or they'll have distributed it at the beginning, but it will be sealed. And so they'll read you some instructions before they tell you to open the seal and begin working on the writing sample. You're going to have 35 minutes for the writing sample, just like you have for the other 5 sections. One major difference, though, is that the writing sample isn't part of your score. So the 5 multiple choice sections determine your LSAT score, which is the #1 most important thing that law schools care about. And your writing sample just gets passed along to law schools that also request your LSAT score. So all the law schools you apply to are going to get a copy of your writing sample, but it's really low on the list of things they care about. And so there's a good chance that they won't even read it. Let's talk about when they might read it and why. So the #1 thing in your application is your LSAT score. The #2 thing is your GPA. And the #3 thing is your personal statement, which is essentially like a 2-page essay that's going to hopefully reveal something somewhat unique about you, that's going to distinguish you from other applicants, make you look like a good candidate for law school, possibly talk about why you think you would be good at law or a good law student. They're actually really complicated to write. You want to spend like at least a month on it. You're going to go through several revisions. You should do some research online about how to construct a good personal statement. It might end up being the best piece of writing you ever make. It's really important. It's a very difficult essay to write. And like I said, it's #3 on the list of things law schools care about, just below your LSAT score and your GPA. And sometimes people write personal statements that are so good and so compelling that it actually helps them get into a school that they might not otherwise get into. And if that's the case for you, if you're getting in somewhere because you wrote such a great personal statement, they're definitely going to read your writing sample because it's a check against the personal statement. See, anyone can help you with your personal statement, and theoretically, someone else might have written your personal statement, for all the law schools know. And so if your personal statement is amazing and it's basically what's getting you into law school, and then your writing sample is gibberish, they're going to know that someone else wrote your personal statement. And so that's one major function that the writing sample serves. It's definitely your writing, because you did it on the day of the LSAT, and it's a check against this other essay that is a pretty big part of your application. And so other than that, it really doesn't serve much of a function. Nobody is getting into law school because they wrote a great writing sample. You might get in because you wrote a great personal statement. That might get you into a school that you otherwise wouldn't get into. But a writing sample is not going to do that. It's like 7th or 8th on the list of things that law schools care about. It's below your letters of recommendation, below your resume, below your transcripts. Then they might take a look at it. But that informs our strategy. Because it's not getting you in anywhere, it can only really work against you. A smart part of our strategy is to play it safe. Don't try to bowl them over with an amazing writing sample. Don't trip over your own feet trying to use big words and impressive language and impressive ideas. You should write a very conservative, simple, straightforward, obviously structured essay. This is something that you want to play it safe on. And they know this isn't going to be your best work. They know that you just took a really long multiple choice test. I'm about to use an analogy, which isn't my favorite, but I think it really drives the point home. So if you plan on getting married, however you're going to look on your wedding day, right? You're going to get all dressed up. You're going to try and look the best you've ever looked in your entire life. That's your personal statement. You're putting your absolute best forward, your absolute best foot forward. And your writing sample is what you look like when you roll out of bed. It's no bells and whistles, no special treatment. In fact, you're going to be a little bit frazzled because you just did a really long multiple choice test, but it's definitely going to be you. It can't be anybody else. Nobody can help you with your writing sample the way that people can help you with your personal statement. And the people who are reading your applications understand that. And so play it safe. Don't go out of your way to try and be impressive because that can only work to do you harm. You're not getting in anywhere based on the merits of your writing sample. And so it's a decision prompt. The way it works is you're going to write an argument. It's going to be kind of like a persuasive reading comprehension passage. They're going to give you a decision that could be argued either way, and you're going to pick a side, and you're going to write a persuasive essay. Now, they're going to give you almost 2 pages of college ruled paper to write on, and they're going to give you some scratch work or some scratch area to plan your essay out. And so what we're going to talk about next is we're going to talk about how to plan your essay, which you should spend about 5 minutes doing. So of the 35 minutes, you're going to spend about 5 minutes planning and about 30 minutes actually doing your essay. And we're going to talk about a simple 4-paragraph structure. One of the things that matters is that it needs to be obvious that you structured it. You want the reader to see clearly, oh, this person thought about what was going to go in paragraph 1 and what was going to go in paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 and paragraph 4. They planned it out ahead of time. You want to make it clear to your reader that you planned it out ahead of time. And you don't want to ignore any big points that might work in your favor. That's another mistake that you can make here. You don't want to misspell. Misspellings aren't a huge deal. Grammar mistakes are more important than spelling mistakes. You do not want to make any grammar mistakes. It needs to be clear that you're a pretty competent writer. But if you misspell a word here or there, they're not going to hold that against you because everybody has spell check these days. So you want to be clear, you want to be thorough, you want to be organized. No one is expecting this to be a masterpiece. And so now let's actually take a look at a writing sample, and I want to give you some more specific strategies about how to plan that 5-minute planning session and then what to write in your 30-minute writing session. One more thing I want to mention is that it's a good idea to fill the space. There have been tons of studies done on essay grading that suggest that anyone who's reading or grading an essay of yours, subconsciously, the longer the essay is, the more esteem they're going to attribute to it. The more they're going to appreciate it or like it. Essays that are longer tend to get higher scores. And so this might even be something, definitely don't write tiny. I mean, don't go out of your way to write absurdly big, but don't write tiny and try to take up the space to the extent that you can. Let's go ahead and take a look at an actual writing sample. The format of the writing sample is consistent from test to test. It's always some instructions, an overview of a choice you have to make, a couple of criteria, and then some details. And the instructions are always going to be the same. The rest of this will be unique to your test, but the instructions are going to tell you that the scenario presented below describes 2 choices, either one of which can be supported on the basis of the information given. Your essay should consider both choices and argue for one over the other. So you're writing a persuasive essay based on the 2 specified criteria and the facts provided. There is no right or wrong choice. A reasonable argument can be made for either. And about half the students on any given LSAT are going to pick choice 1 and half are going to pick choice 2. And there's no right answer. All that matters is that you make a good argument for your choice, which is essentially identifying all of your pros, all of the good reasons for your side, and all of the negatives of the other side. This is not a situation where you should try to appear unbiased. This is not an essay where you go, well, here are the merits of choice 1 and here are the merits of choice 2. That's not what it's asking you to do. It's asking you to pick a side and aggressively argue for it. You get to play lawyer here. Pick a side and advocate for it as hard as you can. Do not be unbiased. You should be one-sided. You should pick your side and be obviously on that side. Now let's take a look at the actual choice for this writing sample. The next part of every writing sample is the choice overview, and here we're talking about Tony, who is a beer brewer, and the choice he faces is deciding whether to start a production brewery, which they define for us. That's a brewery that brews and packages and distributes specialty beer to be sold at other locations. So he's going to have like a warehouse or someplace where he brews beer and then cans it up or bottles it up and like sells it around, I guess. Or he could start a brew pub, which is a full-service restaurant that serves specialty beer that's brewed on site. So he could have food, but he would serve beer at the same place that he brews it. Using the facts below, write an essay where you argue for one option over the other based on the following 2 criteria. And I'm going to underline this twice because it's so important. It's really important that when you argue for one side over the other, that you do so by appealing to these 2 criteria. There are always 2 criteria. And for Tony, the thing he cares about is he wants to develop a reputation among beer critics and connoisseurs for producing high-quality beer. So he cares about his reputation. He also wants to be able to devote time and resources to the development of new beer offerings. Those are the only 2 things Tony cares about. So when we make our decision whether he should start a production brewery or a brew pub, we can only appeal to these 2 things. It doesn't matter if one of those 2 options would make him a lot more money or if they would be close to his favorite place, his hometown. Like, we don't care about anything except Tony's reputation and his ability to spend time making new kinds of beer. These are the things that Tony cares about. I can't overemphasize how important the criteria are, because when you're making your argument, you have to appeal to only these 2 criteria. If you appeal to anything else, That's weakness. That's a weakness in your argument. It shows that you didn't follow the directions, and that would make your essay look bad. That would make your writing sample look bad. So it's really important that whatever you argue for, you do so because it's either going to boost his reputation or it's going to give him the time and resources to develop new beer offerings. And so after they give you the overview and they give you the 2 criteria, they're going to give you details about both decisions. The first one is probably going to be about the production brewery because that was mentioned first, and the second one is going to be about the brew pub. Now, I think you can take notes as you're making your first pass through these, and you're going to have scratch paper on which to do that. And so we'll talk about that in a second, but first let's go through them together just so that we're on the same page as far as what the options are. Or actually, no, let's go ahead and start taking notes now. I'm going to move these choice 1 details up to the top of the page so that I can show you how I would take notes. This is the field that I would make to take notes. This is where I'm going to talk about the production brewery. That's going to be the choice 1 details. And this is the brew pub. Those are going to be the choice 2 details. We'll get to those in a second. But you notice I have a pros and cons thing. And rather than having 4 squares here, I think it's better to think of this as a spectrum because some things are going to be kind of in the middle. It depends how you want to argue whether you would consider it a pro or a con. And I'll show you how I would parse the first bit of details here. So this is all about the production brewery. The first thing we're told is that it would be able to distribute its products to a large geographic area. So far, that seems like it could be a good thing, but it's not really referring to his reputation or his ability to work on beer. But I bet we could spin it that way because we could say the more people you get into contact with, the better you can make your reputation, right? All things being equal, if you're striving for a big reputation, having a large area to distribute to sounds more like a pro than a con. So this is more like a pro, and also notice I put rep by it because it has more to do with his reputation. It has nothing to do with the time he can spend working on beer. So it's a pro based on this first criteria. The next thing we're told is that in order to get his beer in stores and at bars, he needs to put time into sales and marketing. That's time away from making new beers, right? Which is his other criteria. So that's a con as far as working on beer. He's got to put time into sales and marketing. Now, you can mark this up too. So if you feel like you can make these pros and con notes on the actual details here. This is going to be written in your test booklet and you are allowed to write on it, but you're going to have a nice clean area to do scratch work, and you can also do this in the area below. So it depends on how comfortable you are writing abbreviations quickly. Tony's, there are already a large number of breweries that distribute to that area. I feel like you could spin that either way, right? You could say it's a vibrant area for beer, and so there must be a lot of connoisseurs and critics in the area. It's a popular place to be into beer, but you could also spin it as a negative. It sounds like it's a crowded marketplace and there's lots of competition. So that goes in the middle because I could spin that either way depending on which side I decide to advocate. If I'm going to advocate for the production brewery, I'm going to say, oh, this is a lively area for beer and it looks like there must be, or it seems reasonable to think. Now, what I just did there is really important. You can't say there must be lots of critics or connoisseurs in the area because strictly speaking, that's not true. And when you write your essay, you can't overstate things. You can't say things that aren't true. But what you can say is that it's reasonable to think that in an area with a lot of beers being distributed, it's likely that there are critics and connoisseurs in that area. That's more likely that you'd have critics and connoisseurs there than an area that had no beer distribution, right? Because it's a vibrant market for beer. So if something seems likely, say it seems likely. If it seems reasonable, say that it's reasonable. But don't say that it's definite. You can't make things up. It's really important to recognize that fact. You have to say things with the degree of likelihood that is reasonable. So these things in the middle, you can spin them either way. A production brewery's products are likely to be reviewed by beer critics. Well, that's a straight up good thing, right? Because that was part of building a reputation. He's likely to be reviewed, and they talked about critics and connoisseurs reviewing. That's how you get that reputation. A production brewery would initially need to focus on a small number of core offerings. Well, that's not what he wants to do. He wants to make a bunch of different beers, not just do the same 3 things over and over again. So that's definitely a con for working on beers. It's a big con. Notice how far to the right it is. And you can even use this as like a real spectrum. The further to the right, the worse it is. If these small beers prove popular, however, Tony's going to be able to get into a series of experimental limited edition beer offerings. That's what he wants to do. So that's definitely a pro. He might get to expand in terms of beer offerings. He could do these experimental beer offerings. And that's all about working on beer. So notice you're going to take all of these facts and you're going to put them somewhere on the spectrum of pros and cons, and you're also going to keep track of which criteria they appeal to, because we don't make arguments outside of these 2 criteria. And you'll notice it's pretty evenly distributed. It's not all pros, it's not all cons. There are going to be a good mix of pros and cons for both of these. It's important that you gather all of the information, and the worst thing you can do is ignore a big pro for your side or a big con for the other side. If you're trying to persuade somebody and you forget about your best selling point, that's not going to be your best persuasive essay. And so let's go ahead and talk about the details for option 2, opening a brew pub. So here are the details for option 2. A brew pub would draw most of its customers from the local area which has few brew pubs. So first off, that sounds a little bit smaller, and if you were going to advocate for the production facility, you would want to note that this has a smaller area, which I think only really affects the reputation, right? That if you can distribute to a wider area, you have a better chance of getting it to a critic or a connoisseur. You're just reaching more people in a smaller area. Although the fact that it has few brew pubs, you could spin that positively. That's less competition, right? So even though he doesn't have as big of a reach, there isn't a lot of competition. And so whatever critics or connoisseurs happen to be in that area, they're more likely to go to Tony's because there aren't a lot of other places for them to go. Whereas with the production facility, he goes to a larger area, but so do many other people, right? So it's more of a crowded marketplace. That you can kind of spin either way. Tony needs to oversee the day-to-day operations of the restaurant side of the business. Well, he definitely doesn't want to do that. That's a big-time con. And they tell us that this is mostly about food a little bit later. Many of the customers at brew pubs are primarily interested in food. So the less competition thing is a pro. It's kind of in the middle here, but the fact that brew pub is mostly about food, or that people are interested primarily in food, many of the customers, that's a con. He might eventually be able to hire a restaurant manager, though. That's not that strong, so it's kind of in the middle. That would give him more time to work on beer, which if we were going to advocate for the brew pub, we'd point that out as a positive. If we were going to advocate for the production facility, we might not point that out at all. We would probably just point out that he's going to have to do the restaurant stuff for now, and so he's not going to be able to devote that time to working on beer. He's going to have to do some restaurant overseeing. Then we're told that brew pubs are more likely to be reviewed by critics than by restaurant critics rather than beer critics. Well, that's no good because he wants beer critics. So that's where this comes in. The critics who do come in are more likely to be restaurant critics. But if you were advocating the brew pub, you'd say, but there isn't a lot of competition. And so even though more of the critics are going to be restaurant critics, there's still a good chance that he could get some beer critics, right? That's the right force to put on that. There's a good chance that he could get some beer critics through the door. We're then told that beer connoisseurs enthusiastically seek out brew pubs. That's really good because those are part of the people he's trying to get a reputation with. Beer connoisseurs enthusiastically seek out brew pubs, and they share information about brew pubs on social media. That's huge. That could definitely get his reputation up if these beer connoisseurs seek out his brew pub. And he has not a lot of competition in the area. So if you were advocating for the brew pub, these two facts together might be one of your strongest pros. The minimal amount of competition and the fact that beer connoisseurs are going to go out of their way to find him, and if they like his stuff, they're going to get on the internet and tell all their beer connoisseur friends about it. Tony would interact directly with customers at the brew pub. That might be helpful if connoisseurs come in. I see that as being a good thing, direct interaction. He gets to sell himself. He's in charge of his own destiny. He gets to have an opportunity to bolster his own reputation. And brew pubs brew in batches of beer in relatively small volumes and can rotate their offerings relatively quickly. That's also about working on beer, which is one of the things he really wants to do. He gets to brew many things, which was one of our criteria. Now let's talk about what to do when you've got everything on the board. When you've taken all your notes and you've looked at the details of choice 1 and choice 2, how do you actually make the choice? A good part of your decision should be based on your intuition. After reading both of these choices and listing out the pros and cons for each one, which one do you feel like you can advocate for more strongly? In other words, what do you think Tony should do? Should he open up the production facility or should he start a brew pub? That actually matters, but you should also take stock of your pros and cons. They're usually pretty well balanced, and whichever side you decide to advocate for, you first want to make sure that you feel like you could make a compelling case that it wins on one or the other of these two criteria. Because remember, these are the only things Tony cares about. So if we're going to argue for one choice over the other, we have to appeal to these two criteria. And my first body paragraph, I want it to be the criteria that Tony wins on. And it's usually the case that it's split 1 and 1. So for example, I feel like the brew pub is a clear winner for working on beer. In terms of getting to make a bunch of different styles, it's true that he does have the whole, he has to run the restaurant thing. That's a downside for working on beer. but he might be able to hire a manager. And in terms of like the different kinds of beer he gets to make, it sounds like he's going to get to make a bunch of things right away. Whereas with the production facility, it sounded like he was only going to be making 3 things or maybe 4 things for quite a while before he got the opportunity to experiment. So I feel like the brew pub wins in terms of working on beer. And I feel like the production facility wins a little bit more on reputation. It has a wider reach. It's likely to be reviewed, and not by restaurant critics, but by actual beer critics. And while there's a lot of competition, I think we could swing that into a positive, and we could say this is clearly like a really thriving beer market. There's a good chance there are going to be critics and connoisseurs around there, and he's just going to have much more reach with the production facility. So if his goal is to get known quickly, distributing out beer to a large geographical area probably gets you known more quickly than having a little restaurant where you also happen to make beer in the back. And so the production facility wins on reputation. If you're going to advocate the production facility, this is going to be your first paragraph. If you're going to advocate for the brew pub, your first paragraph is going to be about how it's so much better in terms of Tony being able to work on beer. So when you actually make your essay, you're going to focus on all of your pros. So let's just say for the sake of argument that we're going to go with the brew pub. We're going to say Tony should start a brew pub. We're going to focus on all of our pros about working on beer. We're going to spin this in a positive. And we're going to focus on all the other side's cons about everything. The cons about working on beer and the cons about not having a good reach of reputation. If we're going to advocate for the brew pub, we're going to spin this lots of competition as a bad thing. But when you write your essay, you want to focus almost exclusively on the pros for your side and the cons for the other side. There's one exception where you might acknowledge a con for your side, and I'll talk about that when we go to the next slide because this one's getting pretty crowded. All of that note-taking should take about 5 minutes, maybe a little longer, but not too much longer, leaving you roughly 30 minutes to write your essay. And you're going to have 4 paragraphs in your essay. You're going to have an introduction and a conclusion and 2 body paragraphs. And you do need to keep track of time. You don't want to run out of time and leave your essay incomplete. It would be better to kind of rush through the second body paragraph and get a really thin conclusion on the page. A short essay or an essay where it feels a little bit rushed towards the end is better than a half-done essay. But really you want to manage your time. Give yourself about 7 minutes for each paragraph. And actually, I checked that. Maybe 5 minutes for the intro, 5 minutes for the conclusion, and 10 minutes for each body paragraph because it's going to be a thin intro and conclusion. When you write a persuasive essay, I got a really good piece of advice a long time ago. It says, in your intro, you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them. And then in your body, you tell them. And then in the conclusion, you tell them what you told them. So you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. So essentially the intro is going to be really thin. It's just going to lay out the situation, maybe remind the reader of our criteria, and put out our thesis. Tony should choose to open a brew pub. So we might say something like, Tony's facing a difficult decision about what to do next in terms of his career in the brewing industry. He could either open up a production facility or open up a brew pub based on his 2 criteria, which are to garner a good reputation and to be able to work on the kinds of beer that he's interested in. It's clear that Tony should choose to open a brew pub. You might do a few more sentences than that, but basically maybe 3 or 4 sentences, just a really quick, you don't need to tell them the entire situation again, you don't need to go through all the choices, you just need to tell them like basically what's going on. Think of this almost like a persuasive reading comp passage. So you do want to introduce the subject, you want to talk about Tony and how he's facing this choice. You want to remind the reader of Tony's 2 criteria, and then you want to tell the reader what Tony should do. Don't say, I think Tony should do this. Say, Tony should do this. Make it a forceful claim. That is your thesis. So you're going to say what choice should be made. Then the first paragraph is going to be whatever criteria you think you win on or what that choice wins on. You want to lead with your best foot forward. So if we're advocating for the brew pub, I think that wins in terms of working on beer. It's clear that that's the case. Tony doesn't have to be limited to 3 or 4 things. He gets to make a bunch of things right out of the gate. It not only wins because it's good for Tony in terms of it tells us a positive thing about him working on beer, but the production facility has some negative things about working on beer. He has to spend time in sales and marketing. He can only make a small number of offerings initially, and he might never get to make more offerings. That's what you would want to say. So you always focus on your side's pros and the other side's cons. The feeling that writing is going to carry over. Let's see. Nope, we're good. So you're going to lead with your stronger criteria. You're going to include all of your pros for that criteria and all of the other side's cons for that criteria. You're basically putting your best foot forward here. So this paragraph is going to be pretty long, and the topic sentence is important. You want to let your reader know that you've thought about the structure here. So your topic sentence in the second paragraph might be something like, based on Tony's desire to spend time working on his own beer, it's clear that the brew pub is the choice that is in his best interest. And then you go on to say all the good things about working on your own beer in the brew pub and all the bad things about working on your own beer if you open a production facility. Then in the third paragraph, you're going to talk about the other criteria. The topic sentence here might say something like, Tony also has a desire to establish a good reputation among beer critics and beer connoisseurs. And you're going to say all your pros and all the other side's cons there too. And if you can spin things, you want to spin things. So in terms of his reputation, we're going to talk about how he gets to directly interact with clients. We're going to talk about how we'll save this one for a second. We're going to talk about how beer connoisseurs seek out brew pubs and share things all over social media. And the fact that he gets to directly interact with them, that's huge. And he's going to be serving directly to customers. So we have some pros for reputation here. And we're going to talk about how there's a lot of competition. It's a crowded marketplace if he opens a production facility. But we do have some cons here. So one thing you can do in your second body paragraph, because it's going to be the one that is not your strongest foot. You're going to put your strongest foot forward. This is one where you might make a concession. So, he doesn't have that much area, right? It's clear that the brew pub, in terms of building a reputation, it has a larger geographic area. And so you might acknowledge that, but then quickly minimize it. That's a move you can make. You can concede an obvious weakness to your side, but then explain it away. So you might say something like, while it's true that the production facility would have a larger distribution area, it's a really crowded marketplace. And there's no guarantee that Tony's actually going to get reviewed or critiqued up there. Actually, no, I think they said he would definitely get critics. But beer connoisseurs are definitely going to come into his brew pub. You just want to acknowledge it and then minimize it. It's a move you make to make you look unbiased, even though you're clearly not unbiased. So in the second body paragraph, where we're dealing with the second criteria, and these are your topic sentences, by the way. Your topic sentences are definitely going to mention criteria. This is how you let the reader know that you plan the structure. So this paragraph is going to be all about getting a chance to work on beer, why the brew pub's great and the production facility is not. This paragraph is going to be all about building up a reputation, why the brew pub's great and why the production facility is not. And the production facility may have one good thing going for it, but it's not that big of a deal. We're going to explain it away and say that it's not that big of a deal. So that's how we're going to handle the two body paragraphs. Now let's talk about the conclusion. The conclusion is going to be a lot like the first paragraph. It's going to be relatively thin. This is where most of your essay is going to be. These are both going to be probably twice the size of your intro or conclusion, maybe even 3 times the size if you have a lot to say here. So these are going to be really tiny, and you don't want to have any new information in your conclusion. All of your persuasive information goes in the body. The conclusion is literally just to wrap it up and say, maybe remind the reader of the criteria one more time. While the decision facing Tony is a difficult one, actually, no, that would be more towards the end. So you might just say, it's clear that Tony has a difficult situation that he's facing, but based on his 2 goals, the brew pub is clearly going to serve his interests better than the production facility. You might mention a few more things about the situation, but no persuasion happens here. All of the persuasion happens in the middle. The introduction is simply to set the scene and put your thesis out there. You tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. You just remind them about the situation again, remind them about the criteria again, and then land on your thesis one more time. It's clear that the brew pub is the way to go for Tony. And that's it. It's a persuasive essay. Time it out so that you don't run short on doing this. The conclusion can literally be like 3 or 4 sentences. It can be like maybe 5 lines. It doesn't have to be very big. Most of the work is going to go into the body paragraphs. All your side's pros and all the other side's cons. Don't leave out any of your pros. And you can spin things that are in the middle. So going back to, let me erase some of this junk and go back to our notes one more time. So things in the middle, the idea that the brew pub is mostly about food, or that it gets reviewed mostly for food. While that's true, we have beer connoisseurs who are going to come check it out. They seek these types of things out and then they shout out about it on social media. So we may not get as many reviewers in here, but we got a really good chance of getting a bunch of beer connoisseurs in here. And just because the reviews are mostly about food doesn't mean that the critics aren't going to come in and look at the beer too. Remember, there's less competition in this area, so whatever beer critics exist, we got a pretty good chance of getting them to come in because it's not a crowded marketplace, right? So you can spin things that are in the middle depending on which side you're advocating. You can't say things that aren't true. Don't overstate things. That's a bad move. You might feel like that's making your argument more persuasive, but you're really just lying, and that's not an okay move to make. And then you can spin this against the top argument. So the fact that there's a lot of competition, if we're arguing for the brew pub, we're going to make that sound like a bad thing. We're definitely not going to ignore any cons. And these pros, we might acknowledge one of them in our second body paragraph. We might acknowledge the larger distribution area, but then explain it away by saying, yeah, the production facility has a larger distribution area, but there's also a lot of competition up there, and there's no guarantee that he's going to get a lot of attention. He might get to expand, but he also might not, right? We're going to spin that in a negative way because we're arguing for this side. And so that's it. That's how you write the writing sample. It's going to go right by, and like I said, it's very low on the totem pole of things that law schools care about, so there's a good chance it's not even going to get read. Play it safe. Make it clear to your reader that you've planned the structure out ahead of time. Don't trip over yourself by trying to use big words. Keep it simple, and don't ignore any of your side's pros or the other side's cons, and you're going to write a great writing sample.